Morning. It's good to see you this morning. If you're visiting, I'm Bill. I'm one of the elders here at Hope Community Church. It's great to see you. We've been embarking on this journey through the letter to the Colossians. And so within this letter, we're talking about aligning life to God's big story. We just got done talking about 9 weeks of this idea of the co-mission and God's big story. And we talked a bit about aligning life to that, but within the context of the letter to the Colossians, we really see the author, Paul, encouraging them to align their lives to what God has for them as believers. And so we're continuing on in that today. It's pretty exciting. And nope, this thing doesn't really work up here, John, when after everybody's here. There we go. Was that you or me? Awesome. I'll just point it right by Jackie's head back there. We should be good to go. Yes. Well, getting into what we're talking about today, I wanted to pose a little scenario. A father and two adopted sons. So we have this father who's running this business, and he's pretty excited about passing it on, but he has no heir. So what he does is he adopts two sons, and he begins to invest into them. And as they grow, he invites them to participate and to learn about the company, about the family business. And so the one son seems pretty excited. He hangs out with his dad. He begins to learn the trade. He goes to business meetings and partner meetings, and he's really beginning to really embrace and understand what the company is about, kind of what the vision is for the company. And the father's pretty excited about this. The second son, on the other hand, decides, I'm not really into the family business thing. I just want to travel the world. I want to kind of participate in all the experiences of the world and all it has to offer, and I think that's really what I want to do. And so, the father loved both of them the same. But when it came time for his nearing death, he called them both in and he said, guys, I love both of you dearly. I've given my life for this business and for you guys because I want to pass it on to you. But I need to let you know that this son who is faithful, who understood and took on the vision, who participated in what the company was about, I need to let him inherit the entire company because he's the one I believe will carry this on through and the vision for that. But you, my son, the one that decided to travel the world and the 7 seas, I love you the same, and I'm leaving a small inheritance for you so that you might go and get educated and participate in something that will help you be a benefit to society. But I'm leaving the company, all its benefits, all its opportunity, and all its responsibility to the other son. So, that's the end of the story. So the question here is this. Go ahead, John. I can do it from up here, I guess. Did the father do the right thing? He had 2 sons he loved equally. Did he do the right thing by allowing the one son to inherit the business because he was the faithful one who would continue to move it on into the future and not give the company to the other one? Did he do the right thing? Some say yes. I see heads going yes. I see heads going no, right? If you were the father, what would you do? I think I'd leave it to the one who proved faithful, right? I would care for the other one, but for the one that was faithful, I would want to pass that on to him because he understands the in and outs. He's responsible. He's faithful. Well, some of us might say, boy, it's a good thing God doesn't operate that way. Or does he? Or does he operate that way? The question for us would be this. Are there choices that we make today as believers that affect our future with Jesus? Are there choices that we can make today as believers that affect our future with him, with Jesus? That's a really tough question to throw out there, and it's a tough one to answer. But we've got to dig into God's word to see, does he treat everybody the same at the end? Or does he treat believers differently depending on their faithfulness? That's a pretty rough question. If indeed he does, it'd be good for us to know this. Yeah. And if he doesn't, it would be good for us to know that as well. So this is where we're headed today. Are there choices that we can make as believers in the here and now that affect our future with him? And if so, what are those choices? And if not, what does that mean for us right now? Let's pray and we'll get into this. Lord, thank you for your word. Thank you that it's not up to us to answer these big questions like this, depending upon how we feel about how we think you are. But you've given us truth that uncovers your nature and your character and your love, and also how you are operating today and how you'll operate in the future. And we can answer these questions based on your truth. So help us this morning as we dig into this. Amen. Well, I think the letter to the Colossians responds to this, and we'll get some other information from some other letters as well that this same author wrote. But let's just review a little bit here. The church in this town of Colossae is not unlike us today, all right? A few things there. One, it was in a fairly small city. Colossae wasn't a large metropolis. It was a smaller city, much like Williamsport would be. And much like most churches today, they also battled legalism. There were people coming in and saying, man, if you want to be right with God, you gotta eat these things and observe these festivities, and you've got to do these things, and that's how not only we get right with God, but that's also how we grow. And so there was law put on them. And so they were battling that within the church. They were also battling other ideologies coming at them from different views. And so they had challenges with that as well, not unlike us today. We have a lot of ideologies in our culture. Okay, postmodernism is one of those. Secular humanism is another one. There's lots like that we battle in our minds as believers who are part of the Church of Jesus. And so they were battling these same kinds of things back then. And so it really boils down to the question, were they going to live for Jesus or were they going to live for themselves? Were they going to fall into spiritual adultery, meaning combining these other ideologies along with Jesus, or were they going to root them out and keep them separated and put them out where they belong? Same kinds of things that we have to battle with. And so as Paul opens up the letter to the Colossians, we saw that he was continually thankful to God for the work of the gospel in their lives. Recall, Paul didn't start this church. One of Paul's disciples, Epaphras, was from Colossae. He actually went back home, shared the gospel with a few of the believers, and they accepted and believed, and fruit began to be produced. And so in writing to them, Paul had never met them, but he was saying, man, I am continually thankful to God for the work of the gospel in your lives as it is bearing fruit in you, just like it has been in the whole world. And so he gave them definitely a warm welcome here as he was writing. If you're unfamiliar with some of the terms, the gospel at its bare root is really this good news that God has created a way for people to have a relationship with him. And through that relationship with him, not only will they spend eternity with him, but they have the opportunity in this lifetime to be transformed more and more into the nature and character of Jesus, who Paul later says is the exact image of God. That was the good news. That was the good news. And Paul was saying that good news, I'm thankful for the work that good news has had in you guys as it has in the entire world. As we moved on last week, Dick opened up this idea that Paul continually prayed that they would live in a way that reflects the image of Jesus. Right? Paul was no dummy. He was aware of exactly what was happening within the church, that they were battling legalism, that they were battling spiritual adultery. And so he let them know, guys, I am praying for you without ceasing, that you would live in a way that reflects the image of Jesus, that you would be he says that you would be filled with the knowledge of God's will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, meaning walk in a manner that reflects the image of Jesus. And so we're seeing these things connected together. Paul was thankful for the gospel, yet he knew what they were struggling with, and so he says, hey, I'm also praying for you guys, that you would live in a way that reflects Jesus. And so he continues in this manner as we get into our verses for today. I just want to backtrack a couple of verses and take a look at Colossians 1, 19 through 20. This is the end of the passage. So Paul was just talking about the preeminence of Christ, that he is over all, in all, through all. He's the exact image of God. He holds all things together. And then he goes on and says, for in Jesus all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through Jesus to reconcile to himself all things. And then he moves on and he says this, which is pretty powerful. And you guys, so he was just talking about the general work that Jesus did for all believers, but now he pinpoints it right down to the Colossians, and he says, and you guys who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, Jesus has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. And so Paul pinpoints it down to you guys now, the Colossians, all right? And he's very intentional with his flow of thought here. Check this out. I think it's pretty important, actually. So I'm going to reorganize verse 21. So he says, and you guys who? Well, you guys who were once alienated. Okay, this idea of being alienated is living outside of a relationship with God. That's who you once were. You were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. So check this out, right? First thing he talks about here is their state. Your state originally and initially as a human being was one who was alienated from God and hostile in mind. And because of that position, that state, it resulted in doing evil deeds. So even here in the way Paul presents this information, it's kind of a side note, but the flow is really important. Okay, the evil deeds resulted because of the state of the people. The state results in the evil deeds. That make sense? Or we would say the position of those guys with respect to God, separated and alienated, resulted in them doing evil deeds. All right. Pretty important side note there. And he goes on in verse 21 or 22 and he says, he has now reconciled. And you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, you guys, the same you guys, he has now reconciled. Past tense. This is really important to get here. He has now reconciled. Past tense. It's like it's a done deal. It's sealed. The reconciliation has occurred. It's past tense. It's done. It's not going to be undone. That's an important thing. And this state of reconciliation is this position now where, as believers, they were in relationship with God. Sort of like a married couple, you know. Before they're married, they're kind of dangling around with one another. They're dating, you know. They're sort of having fun. They're sort of feeling like, okay, I think it's time to make it permanent. And so they take a step of faith and say, I do, right? Do you take this wife to be your wedded, or woman to be your wedded wife? And he's like, yes, yes, yes. And so they enter into now a relationship. And so for people in God, it's that same way, right? We can play around with God for a while, but there must come a point in time when we say, I do. Meaning, I accept the work of Jesus on my behalf. And God says, okay, now we're reconciled. Now we're in relationship with one another. Oh, and by the way, it's a done deal. That relationship, it is secured, cemented in. It happened in the past. It's done. Nothing will undo it. So he goes on, right? He says, here's what Jesus has done. Notice the he. And you, he, Jesus, has now reconciled. That's what he's done. How did he do this? Well, Paul goes on to say, he did it in his body of flesh by his death. That was the good news that Paul was referring to earlier, that by the death of Jesus, him suffering death in the flesh, that he's made a way for us to be reconciled to God. And so that whole thing there is the state of all believers. All believers, Jesus has now reconciled, past tense, done. Their position is that in front of God. It's as a reconciled child of God, a done deal. It's like the father that adopted the two sons. He didn't unadopt them afterwards. He adopted them and loved them. Legally, it was a done deal. A done deal. Okay, well, this is pretty important. It's pretty important. Believers, though, are reconciled for an ultimate purpose. And that's what Paul goes on to say here. Right? The ultimate purpose for which they've been reconciled is that they would be presented holy and blameless and above reproach before Jesus. All right, let's unpack this a little bit, go back and rethink. And you who were once alienated, the position was not in relationship with God, alienated and hostile in mind. The result was, it resulted in evil deeds. But now he has reconciled you in his flesh by his death. So now the position is in a relationship with God. That opens the great door of opportunity to be presented holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Now, the question has to be this. When does this presentation occur? And is this presentation of being holy and blameless and above reproach before him automatic just because they were believers? When does this occur? And is it automatic that all believers are presented holy and blameless and above reproach before him? That's the question we need to answer right there. Yeah, we need to answer this one. Let's take a look at when. When does it occur? Well, let's look at 2 Corinthians 5:10. This talks about a time when believers are presented before Christ. Check this out. Earlier in the verses here, this is the same author, Paul. Okay, he's talking about this idea of man. Right now, he's kind of in the body, on the earth, doing things, but he longs to be at home or further clothed, to be with Jesus. And then he makes this statement, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Now get this, we must all, he's talking to the church, about the church, and now he includes himself with the church. He says, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what is due. For what? Well, for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Let's read that again just so we can be clear about this. For we who are all believers must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ so that each one may receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. This is talking about a time when all believers are presented before Christ. Yeah, it's talking about that time in the future. And at that time, he says, each one will receive what is due for what he has done in the body, whether good or evil. Well, that's a rather interesting statement right there. Let's see if we can support this further with some other verses. In Revelation 2:23, this is Jesus speaking to the author who wrote the book of Revelation, John. And he says this, "And all the churches will know that I, Jesus, am he who searches the mind and the heart, and I will give to each one of you who are believers according to your works." What in the world is he talking about here? Remember, reconciled, past tense, done, that's our position, that we are a child of God. He's not referring to that right here. He's referring to something else. He's referring to what 2 Corinthians 5:10 referred to, and that is this idea that each one of us who have been reconciled, past tense, done, finished work, will be presented before Jesus, and he will give to each one according to the works done in the body, whether good or evil. It's not that he's going to throw us out and unadopt us. That doesn't happen. But there is going to be this time where our works are assessed as believers. Well, let's go on. I think this verse right here, these set of verses in 1 Corinthians 3, are probably one of the most explained verses on this topic in the New Testament. So if you recall, the church in Corinth was also a mess. All right, they had all kinds of things going on. And so Paul wanted to be very clear in terms of his instruction to them. He says, "According to the grace of God given to me, like a skilled master builder, I laid a foundation." He says, "I laid the foundation of Christ in you guys. I was there. I delivered the gospel. You received it and believed. You are holy and set apart." He says, "But now someone else is building on it. Let each one take care how he builds upon the foundation of Christ." That foundation isn't going to be shaken or taken away. But there are things built on top of that, he says. He says, "For no one can lay a foundation other than what was already laid, which is Jesus Christ." Right? The foundation cannot be undone. That's already set. It's already cemented in. It's solid. No one else can lay a different foundation. But he goes on to say this. "Now, if anyone builds on the foundation of Christ with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, or straw, each one's work will become exposed, manifest. It'll come to light. For the day will disclose it." What day? What is he talking about there? Well, he's referring to that day that we come before the judgment seat of Christ as believers who have the foundation of Jesus already solidified. That day will disclose it because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. Okay? Here we see again, there's a testing and assessment of believers' works. He goes on, "If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire." Are we catching this? There is a time when we will all, as believers, be presented before Jesus, and he assesses the works that we have done while we were living here. Based upon those works, they'll either be burned up in the fire, and we will be saved, but only as one who just barely escaped through a fire, or those works will stand the test and will receive a reward. I think it very clearly answers the question, are there things that we can do now that affect later? We have to say yes. These are clear teachings from the Bible. We can't just willy-nilly around and think my actions don't matter, God doesn't care, he's all full of grace and love. Well, that part is true. He is all full of grace and love. You have been reconciled if you're a believer. That is not going to change. Paul's clear right here. You can do all kinds of evil that you want, but just know that will affect what happens on this day. You'll be saved for sure because God will not disown you. He will remain faithful to his promise. But for those who were faithful, they will receive a reward. This is clear teaching here. Well, holy cow. This is pretty profound stuff. Pretty profound. Well, let's consider the use of the terms holy and blameless and above reproach, because that's what Paul's talking about in Colossians, right? He says that Christ has reconciled you guys in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach. The question is, do those words automatically mean our position in terms or in front of Jesus, that we are positionally clean, or do they relate to the condition, the things that we've done as believers in the body that will be judged? How is Paul using holy and blameless and above reproach? Well, let's see. Let's look at other parts of the Bible to see how holy and blameless and above reproach are used. The word holy, okay, in the original is really this word that means set apart. Okay, it means set apart. In the context of being holy here as we're living, it would be, hey, we live in such a way that we're set apart from those who are alienated. Not that we alienate ourselves from those who are alienated from God, but we live in such a way that it's clear that, hey, we're set apart. We're different. The way that we love is different. The way that we forgive is different. The way that we interact with our kids and our spouse and our friends is different. Okay, these things are different. They're set apart. Well, Peter uses the word here in 1 Peter. He says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. So Peter was calling his hearers to live in such a way that it was easily recognizable that they were set apart. Not that they would live in perfection, because that's an impossibility for you and me, even as reconciled believers. We can't live in perfection, but we can live in such a way that we're set apart. And so Peter was calling those who have been fallen and broken, but yet reconciled, to live in a way that their conduct would set them apart. Not perfection, but set them apart. As God is set apart from the world, in terms of who he is, his nature and his character, you guys live in such a way that you're set apart from the world. Not removing yourself from the world. Otherwise, it wouldn't even be recognizable that we're set apart, right? But to live in the world, yet in a way that's distinct from the world. Okay. This idea of holy will come up again. Blameless does mean spotless. It means without defect. So, let's see here. Does Paul use this word other places where it does not necessarily mean absolute perfection? Well, in Philippians 2, 14 and 15, he's encouraging these believers, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. All right. Is he calling them to live in absolute perfection? Well, wouldn't that be nice? But that's an impossibility. We are on a trajectory where we're being restored more and more into the nature and character of Jesus. But to call people to live in absolute perfection would be an impossibility here. But he's telling them to live in such a way that a charge can't be brought against them, that they would be innocent, that they would live in such a way. He doesn't use holy here, but you can almost gain the sense of this idea of being set apart by their conduct, right? He says, live in such a way that you exist in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, but you shine as lights in the world. All right? So he's calling them to live blameless and innocent and without blemish. He's calling fallen people who have been reconciled to live in this way, knowing that it's impossible to live in perfection. So he uses these terms to call them to live in such a way. How about Paul's view of himself? I think this is pretty profound. In 1 Thessalonians 2:10, he says this, "You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers." There he uses the word holy and blameless. Was Paul perfect? Well, I don't think so. He even says himself there in Philippians 3, not that I have already obtained this, meaning completion, or that he's already perfect, but he presses on to make it his own, because Jesus pressed on to make me his own. So Paul recognizes, hey, I'm not perfect, but I press on toward the goal. I press on toward the goal. But wait a minute. There in 1 Thessalonians, he said that, well, he was holy and righteous and blameless. So how could he be holy and righteous and blameless, which we might attribute to perfection, and yet here in Philippians 3:12, he says, I'm not perfect. Unless holy and righteous and blameless doesn't mean absolute perfection. It means living in such a way that your lifestyle sets you apart and charges can't be brought against you. Accusations can't be brought against you. And I think he says it pretty clearly here also in 1 Timothy 1:15. The saying is trustworthy and deserving of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of which or of whom I am the foremost. All right, 1 Timothy was written toward the end of Paul's life, and he's reflecting on who he is. He's like, man, if you want to assess my life, I am the foremost of sinners, yet Jesus came to save sinners like me. And so we see Paul using the terms holy, righteous, and blameless in reference to conduct, not necessarily meaning living in absolute perfection. All right. And then how about above reproach? Okay, that term means innocent. It means an accusation can't be brought against one. If we take a look at the qualifications for leaders, this is again Paul saying, therefore, an overseer must be above reproach. He doesn't mean live in absolute perfection. But his lifestyle has to be one such that those who are observing it can't bring an accusation against that leader. And he says the same thing in Titus. He says, for an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. And so in all of these instances, we're seeing Paul using these terms, holy, blameless, above reproach, towards the conduct of believers, knowing that no believer lives in absolute perfection. And so I think we can say, yeah, there are times when holy, blameless, and above reproach are used to explain the conduct of believers, not their position, but their conduct. And I believe this is the sense that Paul is using these terms in Colossians here. Yeah, I think so. Let's go back and take a look, right? He says, and you who were once alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body by his death for a purpose, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. Now check this out, verse 23, if indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard. I've heard lots of teachings on this, and this verse 23 there, if indeed, commentators and Bible teachers have said, well, this is the first conditional classic Greek here. It just really can be said since indeed you continue in the faith. But the reality was these guys were not continuing in the faith. They were being tempted to walk outside of that. So how could Paul, in genuine integrity, say, well, since you guys are continuing in the faith, when in doubt, or indeed they were having a challenge with that very same thing? So I don't think it's the first conditional classic Greek here saying, well, it just means since. I don't think so. I think it means, hey, there's a choice that you guys have, and it's conditional. You can be presented holy and blameless and above reproach before Jesus when that day comes. But the way that occurs is if indeed you continue in the faith. There's a requirement and a choice on your part as believers, Paul was saying, to continue on in the faith. If you want to be presented holy and blameless and above reproach, meaning your deeds are assessed as that, as he was calling leaders to live, and as he said he himself was living, then it requires a continual decision to continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard. Paul's making it clear. Okay, the if indeed isn't conditional, pointing back to a modifying you've now been reconciled. Okay, that you've now been reconciled is a past tense, done deal, over, boom, finished. That's a finished work. But he says that work was done so that an ultimate purpose could happen, and that would be you would be presented before Jesus holy and blameless and above reproach. But that's not an automatic presentation for all believers. It's based on decisions that you and I make continually to continue in the faith. Yeah. I was talking to someone recently about this, and they were saying, well, you sound like you're not a Calvinist. Now, for those who know a little bit about Calvinism, a Calvinist would say all people have been chosen before time, to be saved by God, and others have not been chosen. And they would say that there's this idea of perseverance in the saints, that if you've been chosen, then you will persevere in the midst of trials and live in a way that's holy and blameless and above reproach. I think it's clear here that that's not the case. There is a reconciled, done, over with deal. I do accept that part of eternal security for sure. But this presentation before Jesus, that's not a given. That is dependent on our choices, day in and day out. Yeah. It is conditional. Reconciliation's not conditional. Look in verse 22. He has now reconciled. That had everything to do with Jesus and his choice and his work. But he did that so that we might be presented holy and blameless and above reproach. How does that happen? If indeed you guys, we guys, continue in the faith. Okay, if we think back to 1 Corinthians 3, right, there'll be an assessment of the works, wood, hay, and straw, gold, silver, precious stones, that stuff that's burned up. The reconciled are saved, but as one just barely through a fire. For those who built on the foundation with precious stone, gold, and silver, when that's tested and it remains, you'll also be saved, but with a reward. It's pretty clear. Yeah, that's pretty clear. This idea of being presented before Jesus as holy and blameless and above reproach is not automatic for all believers. Our choices today and tomorrow and the next do make a difference. They make a profound difference in this presentation. So get this, right? There are the two positions underlined right there. Position one, alienated, not in a relationship with God, resulting in evil deeds. That's the only choice an alienated person has. The other position is reconciled. But it's not automatic that reconciliation results in a presentation of being holy and blameless and above reproach. But it does open the door for that to occur. It opens up the opportunity. Someone who is alienated never has that opportunity. Someone who's reconciled, the door is open for that opportunity. But again, it's not automatic. It's if indeed you guys continue in the faith. Got to get this clear and solid. The reconciliation is done based on Jesus' work. That's a done thing. This idea of being presented before Jesus as holy and blameless and above reproach on the day when our works are tested, that's not automatic. That's a whole separate thing that will occur. The reconciliation opened a door for that to occur. Your choice and my choice makes a difference on how that will occur. Does that make sense? It's kind of heavy stuff. It's heavy. It's heavy. But it's real and it's truthful and it's right here. So what does this mean to be stable and steadfast and above reproach? Just a few things there. Stable is this idea of being firmly established, having a solid foundation, not easily swayed. All right, stable. You think about a tree that has roots that dig way down in, and there's a huge windstorm that comes along, and that tree, ain't nothing moving that tree, right? It's stable. It is stable. And so Paul is saying that, right? For us as people, as believers. Man, when difficulties come, when winds are blowing, when the storm is there, when temptation is arising, we just dig our roots down into the truth and we're stable. Stable. Steadfast is this idea of being committed. I'm committed to this. Whether I can see what's going on or not, I'm committed. Just like the Bible describes God's love as steadfast love. It's love that's a committed love. It's unwavering love. It doesn't change depending upon what we do or what we don't do. His love is stable, unwavering. He's committed. All right, so for us as believers to be steadfast, it means we're holding on to this with everything we got, no matter what. Whether I can see the future or I can't see it, whether I'm depressed or I'm excited, I'm going to be steadfast in this. Steadfast. And not shifting would mean not removed, not shaken from. Not changing allegiance, if you will, right? So those who continue in the faith, and what does that continue look like? It looks like being stable and steadfast. How does that happen? By not shifting from the hope of the gospel. All right. For those who choose this in this lifetime, Paul is clear. You will be presented before Jesus as holy and blameless and above reproach. And 1 Corinthians 3 says, and you will receive a reward for that. Whew, okay, well, let's go back and review the main points here. The initial state of all people, I think we can discern here, alienation from God. That's it. All people enter this way, alienated from God. Then we saw that there's a state of all believers. What is that state? That state is reconciled to God, entered into a permanent relationship with Him that will not be shaken because God is holding that together. Okay, that cannot be changed. What was the purpose of this reconciliation? Well, the purpose of that is that we might be presented holy and blameless and above reproach before Jesus. That reconciliation opened the door for all who are reconciled to be presented before Jesus as holy and blameless and above reproach. Yet, there's a condition for this reconciliation. The condition is this: we must continue in the faith, meaning we must remain stable and steadfast. The whole issue with the church in Corinth, they weren't remaining stable and steadfast. And Paul's saying, you guys will be saved, but it's not going to be a pretty salvation there at the end. All right, you'll escape, but just as one escaping through a fire. This is also, if you read the book of Hebrews, they were having a very tough time as well, remaining stable and steadfast. So the author in the book of Hebrews was warning those guys, your presentation before Jesus is on the line here. remain stable and steadfast. And so if we kind of put all this together in one statement, I think this will be it. Jesus redeemed us who are believers. He redeemed us for an ultimate purpose so that we could continually choose to engage in his process of restoring our lives to his image, which results in this presentation of being holy and blameless and above reproach. Jesus redeemed us so that we could continually choose to engage in his process of restoring our lives to his image. That's his ultimate purpose, is that we would continue down this path of choosing him over other things. And as we participate in the disciple-making process, our lives become more and more restored to who he is, and he is the exact image of God. And it fulfills God's larger purpose then of filling the earth with his image bearers. And Jesus says, I want you to know there's a reward for those who choose this. Not all believers are going to choose to continually engage. But for those that do, there is a reward waiting for you. That's the whole idea of storing up treasure in heaven, even. When Jesus talked about that, right, in Matthew 6, that's what it's about. Jesus has the treasure there. It can't be stolen, and it's not going to decay. He's got it there waiting for those who continue to be faithful. Yes. So there's going to be a difference when we're standing before the Lord and one says, well, Lord, I accepted you, but I didn't really choose to continue on in the path. I just kind of did my own thing, and you obviously know that. You can see all the works that I did. They're really all about me, and now here I am. And he's like, well, yep, true statement, but no reward, but come on in. Come on in, because I did the work to reconcile you. And the other guy is going to be standing there saying, Lord, I did not feel like following you all the time, but I trusted that your word was true, and I remained stable and steadfast by your power as I chose to continue on. And he'll say, good and faithful servant, come on in. I've got a reward for you. Both enter in, one with reward, one without. Guys, this is very clear teaching from Scripture. All who believe are saved. They're reconciled. But not all who believe will be presented holy and blameless and above reproach. How about for you? Huh? How about for you? Our choices now do matter for then. There is reason, great reason, for you and me to continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, to choose Jesus and what he's wanting over our own desires. There's great reason for that. Here's the truth, though. Many people are reconciled, but only few participate in the restoring process. Only few choose to continue in the faith. Only a few. Why is this? Well, it's hard. Yeah, when Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me, he's not saying, guys, it's going to be a dandy old time. Just come on, and life is going to be good and fun. And I think for us, especially as Americans, we thrive on life just being fun. I just want to have fun. Can't we just have some fun? Well, no. No, obviously, life is not always full of fun the way that we would describe fun. But life can be full of fulfillment the way God describes fulfillment. To know that my life has a purpose, to know that I'm walking in that purpose, to know that Jesus is right there with me, to know that there is a hope in the end, to know that he will reward you and me by saying, good and faithful servant, come on in, I've got something for you. You've been faithful, I've got something for you, and it's gonna be great. But we've got to choose that. We've got to choose it. It's tough. I think the second reason here is this. We're impatient with the restoring process. Now, I'll try this Jesus thing out for a while, but if I don't see changes within the next month or two, I'm out of here. Well, it didn't take you a month or two to get to where you're at, right? That was years of choosing things, years of mindsets being created and generated. It's going to take years to uncover some of those things, to modify the way that we think, and that transforms our conduct. And through that time, Jesus is only looking for you and me to remain faithful to what he's putting in front of us today. And as we remain faithful with that, he'll put more things in front of us tomorrow. But just for today, to remain faithful for that, trusting that he has the process in mind, he will develop and unfold that process, and it will result in us being restored. And as we continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting, it will result in a reward. But that is a choice that we get to make. We get to partner with him in this, which is pretty awesome. It's pretty exciting. Yeah. Well, let's wrap it up with a few questions to consider. Here's the first one. Do you really believe that your decisions now as a believer affect your consequences later before Jesus? We might be able to say, well, it's in the Bible. I guess, sure, I kind of agree with it. But do you actually believe it? Is it something that reaches down into your soul, that impacts you, that you're like, oh boy, this is really true. This really is going to have an impact. And oh boy. Kind of leads into the next question. How many decisions in your life are made considering your future presentation before Jesus? How many decisions in your life are made considering that? I think if we're honest with ourselves, we don't think about that very often. In fact, this isn't a very popular teaching in church at all. This should be stirring within you some pretty deep questions and deep things right now, and you should be going like, I don't even know if I agree with this. Because this hits pretty deep. But this is the way in which God desires for us to live. If he didn't want us to consider the future, he wouldn't have written about it. It's a very important tool that he's given to us to choose to live today. How many decisions in your life are really made considering your future presentation before Jesus on that day? How many? Yeah, I think if I'm honest with myself, very few are made considering that. But this is what Jesus is offering for us to consider, and he's been very clear about it, I think, in Scripture. Last question for us to consider is this. If you take this truth seriously, how should that change the way you live today? If you take this teaching and this truth seriously, that there is going to be a day when we're presented before Jesus with all of our works that we have done while in the body, and that there's going to be a reward for those who remain faithful and not a reward for others who have not remained faithful. If you take that seriously, how might that change the way you live today? Something really to consider. What it should cause us to do is to reconsider how my life might align to God's big story. It's not going to be an easy decision, and your mind is going to think of everything it can to avoid making this decision to line up with this. But that's not going to change the truth of it. The truth is going to remain stable and steadfast. So it's really us who have to make a decision. Are we going to align with this and live in a way that reflects this, or are we going to discard that and live in a way that I feel comfortable. Those are the options. And Jesus just wants us to know we have the freedom to make that choice, but there are consequences resulting from that. And that's it. Yeah. It's big stuff. It's pretty heavy. I think I'm gonna end it there on that heavy note for us to consider maybe some questions that we might have or some comments that we have related to that, because